If you had to pick someone to write the autopsy report on the Wall Street financial collapse 18 months ago, you couldn't do any better than Michael Lewis. He is one of the country's preeminent nonfiction writers with a knack for turning complicated, mind-numbing material into fascinating yarns. He wrote his first bestseller, Liar's Poker, about his experiences as a young Wall Street bond trader when he was still in his 20s. And he has since followed up with 7 more bestsellers on subjects ranging from Silicon Valley and the New Thing to big-time sports in Moneyball and The Blind Side. His new book, called The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine, comes out later this week. And it explains how some of Wall Street's finest minds managed to destroy $1.75 trillion of wealth in the subprime mortgage markets. We spent 2 days debriefing him at his home in California.
This was an episode where capitalism was almost destroyed just by the capitalists. And in the most sensational way, they were sort of destroyed by their own folly.
What happened?
The incentives for people on Wall Street got so screwed up that the people who worked there became blinded to their own long-term interests, and because their short-term interests were so overpowering. And so they behaved in ways that were antithetical to their own long-term interests.
Michael Lewis, a one-time wonder boy on Wall Street, is about to turn 50 now, ensconced in this hillside compound in Berkeley, California. He lives here with his wife, former MTV News correspondent Tabitha Soren, and their 3 children, a 3-year-old son and 2 young daughters who he takes to all of Cal Berkeley's women's basketball games. It's one of the few breaks that Lewis allowed himself over the past 18 months as he dug into the idiocy and negligence that produced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression.
I'm afraid that our culture will come to the conclusion, because it's always the easy conclusion, that everybody was just a bunch of criminals. I think the story is much more interesting than that. I think it's a story of mass delusion.
Lewis's forte has always been discovering little-known facts and characters that change people's perception about a story. So when he finally sat down at his computer with sacks full of research to write about this calamity, he had no interest in Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson or Ben Bernanke or the CEOs of Wall Street's big investment banks, who he believes had no clue what was going on while it was going on. He wanted to tell this story through the eyes of people who were paying attention and who knew that a financial disaster was inevitable.
But there were a handful of characters who actually had seen it coming and made a fortune off of it. And there were so few of them, and there were so many people who had been on the other side, that I thought that I kind of wondered who they were and why they got themselves into that position.
What they saw.
What they saw. Almost more how they saw.
How many people were there, do you think, in the world that understood what was going on?
Between 10 and 20 investors, at most. And this is from a universe of tens of thousands of people who could have conceivably made that bet.
The first one to see that something was seriously amiss in the burgeoning subprime mortgage market was Dr. Michael Berry, a California physician with only one good eye. He lost the other one to cancer as a child and also suffers from Asperger's syndrome, a condition related to autism that often produces an aversion to social contact. Uncomfortable dealing with patients, Berry quit medicine and started a hedge fund in Cupertino, spending most of his time in a darkened office glued to his computer screen. Beginning in 2003, he turned to something that no one else in America was doing: reading and analyzing the pools of risky subprime mortgage loans that Wall Street had been buying up and bundling into highly profitable mortgage-backed securities, which they were selling to investors around the world.
I called up the prospectuses and I read the prospectuses and I looked at these pools. I could see the credit standards within these pools deteriorating just quarter to quarter.
How could you tell that?
There was essentially crappier mortgages being put into these pools, and it didn't seem investors seemed to care, and it didn't seem the ratings agencies seemed to care.
Do you think many people read these prospectuses?
I think the lawyers that put them together, to an extent, maybe.
Do you think the executives at the big Wall Street firms who were issuing these bonds had read them or understood them?
I don't think they read them, no. I think that There were probably junior analysts that were given the task of reviewing these documents. However, I think that this was a profit center. It was a profit center. It was something the organization wanted to do.
In effect, Lewis writes, Michael Berry was doing the first real analysis of the creditworthiness of the subprime borrowers and the structure of the complicated Wall Street mortgage securities, the kind of work that was supposed to have been done by bond rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's so that investors could accurately judge their risk. What you were doing sounds to me like the job that the rating agencies should have been doing.
There's no way the ratings agencies had anywhere near the manpower to look through all that was being issued.
Yeah, but you're one guy. And you found it.
You would think that even if they just looked at a sample, maybe they would have come to a realization. But
by 2005, Michael Berry had come to the realization that the Wall Street bond market had lost its mind. It was buying up hundreds of millions of dollars in dicey loans to unqualified buyers who were, in Michael Lewis's words, one broken refrigerator away from default. Berry concluded that the subprime market would collapse in 2007.
He notices for the first time that there are pools, there are mortgage bonds supported by pools of loans, and most of the loans are what are called negative amortizing interest-only loans, which means that you, the homeowner and buyer, you borrow the money, and you not only don't have to repay your principal, you don't even have to repay the interest. And if you just don't pay anything, they just add to your loan.
So you can't lose your house.
You can't lose your house, right? In theory, right? And so he figures we've reached the end of the road in the insanity of lending. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Now is the time to lay a bet. It's before anybody does.
Berry figured out that these mortgage-backed securities would become worthless if just a small percentage of the dicey loans went bad, and he wanted to bet against the worst of them. He decided that the best way to do it would be to get Wall Street to sell him inexpensive insurance contracts on the securities that would pay off big time if they failed. The contracts were called credit default swaps.
He conceives that they are going to invent on Wall Street credit default swaps on subprime mortgages, essentially insurance contracts on the bonds, before they even do. And he participates in the creation of this instrument. And Michael Berry is the first one in.
Berry assumed a lot of people would figure out what he was up to, but very few did. It took 2 years for the drama to play out, but the subprime mortgage market finally collapsed in 2007, just as he had predicted. So you made a ton of money.
Made a ton of money, much more than I ever imagined, I'd ever have. We made $725 million, I think, on the funds in 2007.
Michael Berry's advantage was he wasn't part of the collective. He was just this guy in a T-shirt and shorts with a glass eyeball and Asperger's syndrome, looking at the numbers, and when nobody else really was.
How can they not look at the numbers? I mean, how can Wall Street be selling all of these, buying all of these mortgages and repackaging them and not realizing that they're not very good mortgages?
Wall Street is able to dilute itself because it's paid to dilute itself. That's one of the lessons of this story is that people see what they're incentivized to see. If you pay someone not to see the truth, they will not see the truth. And Wall Street organized itself so people were paid to see something other than the truth. And that's one of the central messages of the story. You have to be very careful how you incentivize people, because they will respond to the incentives.